In this day and age, we're faced with the problem of over-harvesting our forests. Too few laws are put into place to protect our trees, and the lumber industry cuts down more of them every year. Through the use of questionable ploys and tactics, the lumber industry has been given permission to harvest trees in an old growth located in the Cascades of Oregon. This forest is ancient, and it's been untouched by man for centuries. There are many Native American stories surrounding the forest, which may be the reason there isn't so much as a path through it. Most stories talk of this forest being a sacred place where the spirits of nature live, and that man is forbidden to enter this sacred place. Yet, these are just stories and superstitions from a dying culture. And so, a small group of experienced lumberjacks set up camp at the forest's edge. It was obvious that the place was ancient. All of the trees were massive, and they had moss and other flora growing on every limb. Each one could have sustained its own ecosystem with how much foliage they had. And then there was the dense underbrush that carpeted the ground, making it impossible to see your feet as you walked through. This made for an eerie workplace, and it didn't help me that every morning the forest was shrouded in fog, though it usually disappeared by noon. We began cutting trees 2 days after we'd set up camp. It was a good thing that we began to cut as quickly as we did. The group we had were veteran lumberjacks, but they were a superstitious group and began talking about the woods almost as soon as we got there. Once we began cutting, they shifted their focus from superstition and lore to the work at hand. We'd been cutting for 2 days without incident and were well on our way to filling our quota when that night, at dinner, we heard a knock at the door to the cook shack. This startled many because we were many miles away from any house, and no one was supposed to be here but us. We opened the door slowly to reveal a Native American man standing on the step. He looked as if he was a tribe elder. He had to have been about 70. He was wearing only leather pants and moccasins, very strange attire for fall weather. His bare skin was a deep brown colour, almost the colour of tree bark, and due to the cracks all over his body, it seemed to be fitting. Then there was his hair. It had dreadlocks, which was very unusual considering his nationality. His voice was raspy and deep, like he needed water. He asked us, "What are you doing in this sacred place?" "We were given permission by the federal government to clear-cut this forest," I replied. "This forest is not the property of your government. The spirits of the earth demand that you leave immediately," he rebuked. "But our paychecks depend on us cutting these trees." "But your lives depend on you leaving this sacred place. You've been warned." He then turned and left without another word, walking straight into the forest. I tried to stop him, but he vanished the moment he entered. We searched for him for a short time, but couldn't find a trace of him. His warning was disconcerting, but we had work to do. And how much damage could one old man do? The next 2 days were a nightmare. It was almost as if the trees suddenly became iron. Our axes couldn't cut them anymore. We even had a few axes that broke when they hit the tree, so we brought in chainsaws, which worked for a day, but then they too began to break. I ended up sending 2 guys to the hospital when their chainsaws broke, and the chain links hit them like shrapnel from a frag grenade. One of them would need complete facial reconstruction, while the other had to have his right arm amputated. I didn't know it then, but they were lucky they got out when they did. That night, I was trying to figure out how to boost morale and find a way to cut those infuriating trees. Then, one of the crew burst into my office, saying that the Indian man was in the forest, watching the camp. I jumped out of my chair and ran out to confront him about being in the woods and spooking my men. When I got out there, I was 30 yards in front of him, with the whole camp behind me. I gave you plenty of time to leave, and now you will face the consequences. Now wait a minute, I shouted as he faded back into the forest. 2 of my men went in after him. After about 5 minutes, one came back, saying he couldn't find anyone. We spent the rest of the night looking for the second man, who vanished in the forest after going in after the old man. None of the teams of 2 I sent into the forest found anything, so I made the decision to take the next day off and let the workers recover from their long and fruitless night. As I went through the camp in the late afternoon, I heard the men call the forest cursed, and they took to calling the old man the druid. I knew there was no way to stop my men from talking, and I'd have to accept it and try and find a way to up their morale before they started walking over me. I decided I'd have to bring in heavy equipment to clear out the trees, so I made a few phone calls and got some bulldozers and other big rigs to be delivered out here. That night, I informed my crew that the cavalry was coming in, and that in a couple of days we'd be back on track. The crew was excited to hear this, and that raised morale drastically. We had dinner without incident, and for that time, it seemed like things were going to turn around. After dinner, we were all going back to our cabins when we noticed a young tree in the middle of the camp. All I could think of was, how was this possible? A tree can't just sprout up like this in a matter of an hour or 2. As we approached, I started hearing the talk from this afternoon returning, most saying that the druid had grown this tree in our camp. All the small talk soon came to an end as we gathered around the tree. The small talk turned into prayers as we saw the worker that went missing the night before. The tree had grown around and through him. His face was frozen in a contorted grimace of unimaginable pain. His arms and legs were encased in the wood of the tree, while 2 branches had burst through his chest and grown up to frame his face in their bark. Confusion and horror filled us all as we looked upon his ghastly demise and wondered how this had come to be. It's not possible for a tree to suddenly sprout, let alone encase a living being like this. Then, there was the question of how it had gotten into the middle of camp. We hadn't heard anything, so it couldn't have happened in the camp. And to have moved it here by hand would have taken too much time, and there would be marks on the ground from people walking and digging. But the earth was unbroken, as if the tree had been here the whole time. We sat there staring at him for nearly an hour in silence from the shock, before someone shuffled off to return with a can of gasoline and a lighter. To our surprise, he doused the tree in gasoline and then lit it on fire. We all watched it burn in silence for a time. Then many began to pray or sing hymns to a multitude of deities, When the tree was nothing but ash, we finally came out of our stupor. Almost my whole crew left right then, and I couldn't blame them. I would have left too, if it didn't mean being crushed under gambling debts when I got back. The few that stayed were in the same boat as me, where if they returned, they knew they would be damned. But if they stayed, who knew what was going to happen? In the small hours of the morning, and with a half a bottle of scotch, I decided I was done waiting on the druid. I was going to take the fight to him. I rallied the remaining workers and armed everyone with axes, gasoline and lighters, and set out into the forest. It was nearly pitch black, and the morning fog had begun to rise, making it nearly impossible to see farther than a foot in front of you. Disregarding these impairments, we went deeper into the forest. We were all on edge. We couldn't discern anything, and we jumped at every shadow and noise from the creaking wood. After about 20 minutes, and my wits somewhat returning, I decided it would be fruitless to search for the druid, and we'd have to lure him out. So I gave the order. Boys, burn it to the ground. Many of them shouted their support as they began splashing the gasoline on everything around them. Soon, all of our gas cans were empty, and we'd regrouped a short distance from the doused area. As one, we all lit our lighters and threw them into the saturated wood. The moment the lighters hit the gas, the forest turned into a ball of fire, and in seconds was a raging inferno, spreading rapidly from branch to branch. I don't remember when we all started to run, but we were running as fast as we could through the blazing wood. Then there was a primal shriek that was filled with unimaginable rage so loud that we all fell to our knees, gripping our ears in agony. In that same moment, the forest returned to the darkness that we'd replaced with a blazing bonfire. As we shook off the pain of that shriek, the forest began to take on an ethereal glow, and in the middle of it all was the druid, who was the image of rage in that moment, before suddenly he was swallowed up by the forest. The forest came alive around us as we started running for our camp. As we ran, I saw a man grabbed by a vine and lifted high into the trees to an unknown fate. The man that was in front of me was swallowed up by the earth as the trees moved their roots, and was crushed when the trees moved their roots back into place. The last of my men were impaled by branches and carried off into the canopies while I continued to run. I didn't know why I'd been spared when everything around me seemed to want me dead. Then I stopped running. I'd been turned around and was returned to the place we'd tried to burn. In the middle of the scorched earth was the druid, sitting with his back to me. I pick up a stone on the ground, meaning to end this once and for all. I crept up behind and raised the rock above my head. As I brought it down for the killing blow, greenery exploded from the druid, and the scorched earth was covered in foliage and young trees. In that explosion of greenery, I dropped my rock. I was about to search for it when the druid spoke. "I warned you that this was a sacred place, and that if you didn't leave, you would die." "We couldn't have left even if we wanted to," I responded. "Would the consequences of you leaving been worse than what you have suffered here?" At this remark, I kept my silence, unable to come up with an adequate response to someone who knew so little of our lives and society. "If you would have left, you would have kept your lives and sought out other ways to feed your greed. But your greed kept you here and made you believe this place was your way to wealth. And for that, your men have paid dearly." I couldn't speak, and he slowly approached me with a look of contempt and sorrow. "For what you have done here, many have died, and you await your punishment. But before I can punish you, there is something you must do. You must go back to your people and stand as a witness to the powers of the earth and warn them of what will happen should they ignore you." At this, he motioned to the trees around him, and several young trees came to him, gliding on their roots over the earth. Each tree had one of my men that came with me into the forest, their faces wrought in agony of their dying moments. Then, with a second motion, they went away back into the woods. He then opened his hand to reveal an acorn in his palm. He took that acorn and pressed it into my chest. I could feel it burrowing into my flesh. I would have collapsed from the pain if it weren't for the druid holding me up with his other hand. "With this seed, you will face the same fate as those you led to the slaughter. Only after you bear witness to the things you have seen here tonight. Then, you will stand as a warning to them, like those you just saw. Now, away with you." He shoved me roughly through the woods, stumbling right into the middle of our camp, if you could call it that anymore. The forest had reclaimed everything that wasn't destroyed. That's when I realised what he meant about my men standing as examples. They stood at the edge of the forest as sentries, warning those who would dare to enter the forest against the will of the earth spirits. And that is how I came to be the last man to leave my camp alive. I came here right away to report my findings and advise the board to leave the forest alone and keep anyone else from entering it. Before any board member could respond, I felt the acorn begin to grow inside of me. I knew then that the end was near. With that, I died in the middle of the boardroom, to the sounds of screams and rending flesh, as the tree burst through my chest, ending my life with the beginning of a new one.